Did you miss your deadline to renew your Medicaid coverage? You can still send your completed annual review form to Healthy Connections Medicaid. You may be assigned to another health plan, but you can ask to come back to First Choice within 60 days of renewed Medicaid eligibility. It's your family. It's your choice. First Choice is the right choice. Renew and choose us. Visit selecthealthofsc.com/renew to learn more.
This is a CNA podcast.
Now, let's face it, online shopping has reached unparalleled levels of convenience. With just a few clicks, we can easily add items to our carts, wait a mere few days, and the package arrives right at our doorsteps. Trust me, I speak from a wealth of experience. But here's the thing, all that convenience is not without a cost to our planet. Out of all industries, the transportation and logistics industry is one of the biggest culprits when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. But fear not, because on today's episode, we're going to be exploring how it's trying to find greener ways of delivering our packages, from electric vehicles or EVs to sustainable fuels. We are joined by Christopher Ong, Managing Director of logistics company DHL Express Singapore. Chris, thanks for joining me on the Climate Conversations.
Good morning, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here.
I mean, your industry has certainly enjoyed quite a boom period, I must say, during the pandemic. And now, as we transition out of the COVID era, how is the current e-commerce or logistics landscape looking like right now?
Well, certainly it's been a very volatile 12 months or so, especially since the normalization has started to occur. So, of course, in 2020, 2021, we were seeing peak volumes because everything was shut, people can't travel, and so everyone was buying online. And as a result of that, you're right, the courier industry really saw a huge boom during that period. And in 2022, I think we've started to see some normalization. And especially with the opening up of countries, it has resulted in availability of more capacity. Most people didn't realize that half of the world's air cargo actually traveled on the belly of passenger aircraft prior to the pandemic. So, of course, when the pandemic occurred, all of a sudden, half of the capacity disappeared. I mean, demand also dropped, but not as fast as capacity. Now that things have started to normalize, of course, we've seen freight rates as well as volumes start to normalize as well.
The pandemic certainly served as an eye-opener for many people of that, wow, logistics is really important. So let's talk about what happens behind the scenes. Take us through how our parcels that are, let's say, leaving a seller in China make their way to Singapore and arrive at our doorsteps.
So we provide a door-to-door service. And what that means is that our courier actually picks up the parcel from a seller, be it in a warehouse or an office, which then travels to one of our service centers to get processed. And once the shipment is processed, it then gets trucked to our gateways, goes through export processing, gets loaded onto a plane, which then flies to our Central Asia hub in Hong Kong, and then thereafter gets redirected to where it needs to go next. So it could then go off to the US, or it could come down here in Singapore. Once it reaches the destination gateway, it then, of course, goes through the customs processes for import, and then sent out to another service center, and finally it gets delivered at the last mile.
Wow, sounds like a complex process there, Chris. So running things like you mentioned airplanes, trucks, just roughly how much carbon emissions are we talking about when we move goods around the world?
Perhaps we need to look at it at a high level first. So if we talk about the aviation industry, it's estimated that the aviation industry as a whole, including cargo as well as passenger, emits about 2.5% of global carbon emissions.
That's a lot.
Over 1 billion tons. And it's been growing quite rapidly with more and more air travel. In fact, if aviation industry were a country, it'd be among the top 10 countries in the world.
Wow.
And it emits more than places like Brazil, Mexico, and even the UK. And given the propensity for people to now take low-cost carriers and to travel to see new things, the International Civil Aviation Organization expects that aviation emissions could grow by 300% or more by 2050.
That is pretty worrying.
Yes, that is a significant challenge. For DHL, about 70% of our emissions actually come from aviation. Okay, so it is a significant part of our carbon footprint. And so when our global chairman, Frank Apple, committed in 2017 to get to net zero by 2050, that was a big ask. That was a really, really big, ambitious because we have over 600,000 colleagues all over the world. And the fact is, we have one of the largest fleets of aircraft. Now, to give you a sense of how much carbon is emitted per parcel. So if, let's say you're shipping something to a friend in Japan, for example, a 3-kilo shipment will emit almost 15 kilos of carbon to move from Singapore to Japan. Now, if that friend is living in the US, it would be almost 30 kilos of carbon for that 3-kilo shipment.
Chris, your industry has to take into account the speed and also have to manage that against the cost and environmental impact now. It's quite a tough balancing act, I'd imagine.
Yes, certainly it is. In the beginning, we set about greening our operations by setting efficiency targets. So since 2007 till about 2017, the focus was really about just greening our operations, greening our buildings using solar panels, trying to electrify our first and last mile, our ground fleet, right? And in that period, we have improved our efficiency over 30% on a per parcel kilometer basis. But in 2017, we realized that that's not enough because overall emissions continued to rise. The biggest challenge was the air. But in the last few years, with the advance in technology, especially in sustainable aviation field, that we see as a significant breakthrough. The biggest game changer. It means that because we're using things like used cooking oil converted into aviation fuel, we're actually not producing additional carbon as a result.
Very interesting. So, Chris, let's just delve a bit more into how DHL is cleaning and greening its operations. So, I understand the company has a target to reduce all logistics-related emission to zero by 2050. So, what's being done to ensure progress towards the target? Because we're just talking about how ambitious that goal is.
So, we of course have interim targets. For example, we have committed publicly that by 2030, we expect to be less than 29 million tons of emissions. In 2021, for example, we were emitting about 39 million. So we had to cut about 10 million tons of CO2. So every year, we're working towards that. Last year, 2022, we went from 39 to about 36.5. So part of it was because of volume decrease, but the other half of it was because we greened our operations. So we're setting these targets for ourselves and making sure that we have progress.
Are you looking for ways to make your money work harder for you? Or need tips on saving, investing, and making financial decisions? Join me, Andrea Heng, on Money Talks, CNA's top personal finance podcast. From investment basics to the FIRE movement and legacy planning, Money Talks looks at financial trends and stories that matter to you. Check out our complete playlist on the CNA app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us or subscribe for new episodes every Tuesday.
So Chris, let's go back to the DHL's conversion to EV. Last year, DHL announced that it has about 80 to 90 electric vehicles in Singapore's roads. How are they being used right now? Could you also talk about the charging infrastructure, how it looks like in DHL sites?
So essentially, we have 90 of these EVs running around. They're on the road daily. Now, in the past, people were concerned about electric vehicles because they felt that they wouldn't be able to survive a day on the road because the range was insufficient. In the early EVs, probably had about 200 kilometers of range in a day, and then you'd have to scramble to charge the vehicle in the midst of your route, etc. The good news is the modern EVs that have come online over the last 12 months or so now have in excess of 300 kilometers of range.
Right.
For a small island like Singapore, we have over 300 vehicles. So on a daily basis, our vehicles go on their routes, and typically they only use about 40% of the battery in a day because our routes are rather compact. So a lot of the couriers tell me, hey, we could go 2 days. And this is again with the air condition going and rain, shine, and the vehicles are performing really well.
But I'm sure there are challenges. I mean, were there any hiccups or bumps in the transition?
Originally, the couriers didn't really like the vehicles.
Why is that?
Because they felt that the vehicles were very jerky. The minute they took their foot off the accelerator, the regenerative braking would kick in and they'll feel that it wasn't a smooth ride. So we started to equip them. We gave them driver training. We explained to them why we had to make these changes. And essentially, we allowed them to try it out on their routes. And thereafter, they loved it. Because in the normal box vans, they're actually sitting above the engine. And so there's a lot of vibration, noise, and heat. whole day sitting on top of the engine makes the passenger cabin of a normal van actually very uncomfortable. So what happened was all of a sudden it was quiet. The pickup was great because we also taught the couriers how to drive by slowly easing off the accelerator so that instead of driving up these ramps of these big warehouses, the vehicle actually slows down smoothly.
Well, it's a win-win for everybody. I wonder larger, heavy trucks are following closely behind?
Okay, so that is one area that we do have a challenge. We've been looking for options for heavier vehicles, but once you get to the 2-ton, 3-ton type levels, we haven't really found the right ones, at least here in Singapore.
So electric cargo ships and planes, is that the future? Would that be an option to consider?
Currently, I think battery technology, the weight to power ratio for batteries is not great for aviation at this point. EVs are actually heavier than normal cars, which causes a little more wear for tires and so on. And for planes as well, if you want to go even longer distances, higher payloads, the batteries get really, really heavy. So one alternative that we're looking at is potentially hydrogen in hydrogen aircraft. The plane manufacturers, engine manufacturers are looking at right now. I don't see that happening perhaps in the next decade or so, but potentially technology can get to the point where we can actually use hydrogen as the source of fuel.
Let's talk about shipping then. Some experts suggest that slower shipping is greener, that a 10% drop in cruising speed could cut fuel usage by 30%. But, as the company named DHL Express Singapore, which sort of stresses the speed part of it. I mean, how can you compromise speed and sustainability when it comes to your deliveries?
For shipping, it's our colleagues at the DHL Global Forwarding, and they work with the shipping lines to also use sustainable marine fuel. But you're right. I think it's about finding that balance between the speed as well as the emissions. But what I have suggested is that the traditional way of how goods move around the world is dependent on forecasts. So, for example, the latest spring-summer collection of a particular brand, it's based on what they think people will buy, right? And so they manufacture based on that assumption. Unfortunately, some of it goes to waste. The manufacturing goes to waste and the shipping from place to place goes to waste because the demand may not match. And so something to think about is really about what we call the total emission of supply chain, including the production. If people only buy on demand, which is what we do on, for example, e-commerce, then there's less waste in the whole process and not just in the logistics piece of it.
What can customers do? What role can they play?
I suppose, given busy lives, choose the lockers. And that's something the Singapore government has been pushing. Now, there's this set of federated lockers all around the country. They promise that within 200 meters of any lift landing, there will be a locker. It's a safe location that enables courier companies, not just DHL, any courier company, to have a safe delivery. If you imagine, there can be instances where up to 5 to 10% of deliveries are reattempted because people are not at home. By actually enabling the first attempt, it reduces the overall carbon emissions, that's one, but also the overall costs.
Logistics companies can't do this alone. And you just mentioned governments, retail partners, customers as well. I mean, what actions should other stakeholders play? Because it should definitely be all hands on deck approach.
So we've just been talking about emissions, right, of a delivery, but there's also lots of things associated with packaging. And we need to find ways to be as efficient as possible in packaging. Sometimes you notice you buy an item that's probably the size of your palm that comes in a box that can fit a laptop. It does happen, right? So the question is, okay, how can we then reduce a bit of that waste, right? That's one. But two, an opportunity to then have a circular return. For example, smart lockers, perhaps you could have a recycling partner literally right next to the smart lockers to pick up all of this, which then can go back into the repurposing. And I think as more and more people continue to buy online, to be able to recycle a lot of the packaging that comes with the items, because that will certainly help in ensuring that the carbon emissions overall for e-commerce will actually reduce over time.
There's so much we can do. And Chris, before I let you go, I mean, how do you measure your sustainability performance and what other intermediate goals lie ahead between now and 2050?
Well, sustainability for us, three aspects: the environment, the social, and of course, governance. I think on the environmental front, we certainly focus a lot on reducing our emissions. For example, we account for our emissions monthly, which allows us to see whether abatement activities that we have performed are actually going in the right direction. I think on the social part, as an organization, we're committed to being a great place to work, because if employees are engaged and they feel purpose in what they do, chances are they will stay with the organization and support the communities around them. And finally, of course, in terms of governance, we look at whether it's human rights, cybersecurity, and so on. I mean, again, these are all scorecards to look at, hey, are we moving in the right direction? Overall, it's not just purely about carbon emissions. You need to look at this holistically, ensuring that people are not only engaged, but also making the right decisions for the organization as well as the community.
Well, Chris, speaking on behalf of those of us who can't do without our online shopping and home deliveries, we certainly wish you and others in the industry all the very best when it comes to finding more innovative and sustainable ways to green the logistics sector. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Julie.
Well, thanks to my guest, Christopher, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. We hope you enjoy this episode, and do remember to subscribe and like this podcast so you know when a new episode drops. You can find CNA's climate and sustainability coverage online at cna.asia. The team behind this podcast is Joanne Chan, Saye Win, Jacqueline Chan, and Crispina Robert. And I'm Julie Yu, signing off.